We are so honored. One of my very kind and amazing colleagues, brilliant colleagues, is here with us, ours. This is Dr. Kiki Kosnick, who is at Augustana College in Rock Island, Illinois. Is that right?
That's correct.
Yeah? You're gonna have to tell us what that's like, because I have no idea. And the perfect combination, an associate professor of French and gender and women's studies. We love that. Women, gender, and sexuality studies, even better. And Key's work centers queer and feminist linguistic interventions with a focus on language pedagogy and literary studies. We are so proud to have closing out this conference, Kiki Kosnick. Please give a round of applause.
Hi, everyone. I didn't put all the kinds of classes I teach on this cover slide because I thought it would be too much text, but like Ben said, I'm primarily recently tenured associate professor of French. I also do teach in our Women, Gender, Sexuality Studies program. My graduate work was in world literature in French, and working more on the kind of like applied linguistics pedagogy side has been a little bit newer for me, and I'll talk about that. But Augustana College is a small residential liberal arts college in Illinois, a few hours from Chicago on the Mississippi River. We have about 2,500 students from around the country and around the world. And it's a really wonderful place to do this kind of work in a multilingual community, but in a small community. And so it's just such a gift to be here with you all today. It's been so enriching and inspiring already. And I'm really honored to have the chance to talk with you to close up the day. I do want to say huge thank yous. It's not all the time that we have a beautiful conference like this that has been brilliantly organized and funded so that we just get to show up and it's super accessible. And so thank you to the organizers. Thank you to USC for making the space available and to the people who paid for it. There's always things. And all the contributors. So I'm really glad everything's recorded for the sessions that I didn't get to be in today. I put a link in the chat to a Google Drive, and I'll have a QR code for it coming up in a second, but that's all my slides if you'd like to access them in a different format. I want to talk about myself for just a moment, kind of in the way that I do with my students, only slightly differently because we're peers. But I'm a white person who was a first-generation college student, and now I get to be a faculty member, which is a huge privilege every day. Because I teach French, and French is a growing world language due to the ongoing impact of colonialism. These are tensions that we have to grapple with all the time. And so when we're thinking about gender and sexuality, for me, we have to also always be talking about race and ethnicity and class and disability and thinking in intersectional ways about this work. I've been a queer person all my life, but I didn't have language for it until, really college. But I started dating people of the same assigned sex when I was in high school. On the left, you have a picture of me being really into meta and coming from an area where there literally is a place called Mullet Lake. And so I have mullet hairdo. The Mullet Lake on that sign should actually have a second T for the fish. But anyway, this was kind of like my whole aesthetic, right? And like language is funny and like identity is interesting, but I was really strongly identified with queer women's community for a long time. And as I had more and more non-binary and trans friends coming out, and I was teaching language, French language at University of Wisconsin at the time and involved in community. And I realized I didn't know how to talk about my friends. So I started finding workaround strategies. And as a person involved in literature, I looked to literature and looked to poetics to support me in moments where I didn't know how to express something. And as someone who learned French as a second language, that's also a big part of the work, right? Like having different registers, not really knowing how to say something one way, but being able to figure it out a different way. And so that was always something that was kind of embedded in my pedagogy. But when it came to naming the lived experiences of my beloveds, that was super important. And so for me, that positioning statement is how I wanted to, open our time together, but also as a little glimpse of parts of things I talk about with my students and why I value what a privileged space it is to be in the classroom with them. And if I hadn't had a lot of support at different points in my journey, I wouldn't get to be a faculty member and I wouldn't get to have that space with these brilliant young people, and sometimes people of different ages, but we mostly have a homogeneous age group at Augustana, but that's changing a little. And it's really wonderful to accompany them. And so this is kind of me, from the queer me to the queer me, who is also the me who tries to take a professional photo for a college website. I use they, them pronouns in English, but I also use a shortened form of my name, Kikis. If you hit that hyperlink, you'll get information on a concept called proper pronouns that my partner and I work on. And in French, I use non-binary pronouns as well. The most common one, yel, and I do use non-binary agreements, although as we'll talk about, and as most of you know, sometimes people use one set of pronouns, but different kinds of agreements that are binary, for example, because agreements can be really complicated. So we're going to talk about some of that together today. So here's the QR code if the link in the chat isn't as good for you as the QR code. To the drive. In that drive, there's all the slides, and you'll find that there are hyperlinks on the slides as well. So there are not citations, but there are hyperlinks. So if you want to kind of get in there and find out more about something, please do that. Some things I'll move through a little bit more quickly than others. There's also a document, two documents, like a Jamboard and a Google Doc. If at any point you want to brainstorm outside of the chat or share anything, everyone is privileged to do that. So what I want to talk about today and work through together and keep thinking about is how to activate this relationship between invention and intervention. And I really almost stopped myself from putting a parentheses in my title for the keynote, but I was like, I really like this. I've been playing with it a lot lately, the invention and intervention piece, and what that looks like in our language classrooms and in the world when we're working for gender justice. And so that's kind of going to be our point of departure, and something I'm going to try to continue to come back to throughout the talk. So when I think about invention, you have these words that come up, new and old. I think old, you invented it a new way, recombining, evolving, fluid, these kinds of things. But specifically, as we're applying that to forms, linguistic forms, methods, pedagogies, right? And this is also always enmeshed in embodiment as well, and then in different bodies together in communities. Language is a shared activity. I'm also thinking about agency, autonomy, and self-authorship, particularly here. Intervention, I think about calling in and calling out practices that many of us are always working on growing in our classrooms, and supporting our students and doing for each other, and hopefully sometimes being brave enough to do for us. For me, that's something I appreciate. If a student does tell me there's something more you need to learn about this, Kiki, I'm doing something right that they're comfortable to tell me. So that reflective practice piece, I think, is so valuable in this work, and being willing to course correct, right? Like, we have to be willing to have the conversations. I see people just petrified to try to start to use something because they don't want to make a mistake. It's okay to make mistakes. Like, the problem for me, always to name, the problem is in systems, the problem is in language, the problem is not with humans. Humans, once we recognize, ooh, language is a problem here, what can we do? Now, how do we move forward, right? How can we be together in that? And so I think about interventions with all these antis, it's anti-conventional and anti-normative and anti-elitist and anti-imperialist and anti-purist. And here's where I want to connect some of our thinking around gender just language to other language practices that can be considered sometimes to be innovative or revolutionary, but that also sometimes are just finally getting attention, right? It's not that these things haven't existed for a long time or that people haven't been languaging in many different ways, but we have academies that perpetuate one version of the language very often, right? And it's a miracle if they accept two spellings of something. So invention and intervention together, laying the groundwork. Commit to ongoing self-education and self-reflection. Curate diverse representation and possibilities for authentic self-expression and communication across differences. Center approaches that are queer, anti-racist, anti-sexist, anti-classist, anti-ableist, decolonial, and trauma-informed. These are all things I care about. I have to name it in that way because I'm not an expert in all of those things. I resist the idea that I'm an expert on gender inclusive language practices, although I've more and more gotten asked to do things like this, and it's such a gift and I enjoy it so much. And then I feel amazing because I got to be with smart, like-minded people who care and value this work and know how desperately the world needs it. So at least I feel included. So if I were like starting a class, maybe I would use something like this and just take a second and see, you know, is there one of these little faces you feel drawn to? Some French education majors who were working with me on some pedagogical development for materials helped with this, and a graphic designer. And so the idea here is that even if you were in a space where you could not use the mid-dot forms, which are contested, right? Could you put the parentheses back in on that E? Sure, you could, but any one of these could be pronounced orally and it wouldn't be gender marked. So whether it was an epicene form or just the pronunciation isn't differentiated, it's a nice way to allow everyone to share. And in most cases here, some of these are words that are used all the time, and others are finding you know, a synonym. And so that's a major strategy for me that I like to start spaces with. From the beginning of a class to the beginning of whatever class period. And I'll talk a little bit more about why that is. So overview of what I'm going to do in my time until the Q&A, which I love the most, is I'm going to start with some guiding principles, and some will be kind of recapping what we've heard throughout the day, and especially some things that we heard from Wes's keynote this morning. If you got to be at it, it was awesome. I loved it. And then I have these kind of two challenges that I've established that are part of my own thinking all the time. And I'm going to kind of embed that in the conversation, and hopefully we can work through some of those. So how do we affirm diverse genders without making gender essential? We have to do both things. So this is a huge both and. Another challenge is, how do we establish sanctuary spaces? This is the word I've landed on recently, and I really like it. I have some resistance to the whole safe space stuff because you never know how someone's going to feel safe or not, but sanctuary feels a little bit more like an intention. But I like to establish a sanctuary space where we prepare our students for realities beyond their purview, while also working to change those realities. So what I mean here is, how do we get to do this in our classroom, but also do the thing that allows them to go out and be in other places that are more hostile, right? So we're going to think about that. How do we teach all those forms of languaging, and how do we practice that and study ourselves? And then we're going to move into some approaches to navigating these challenges. And I've tried to create a structure that'll be approachable to folks teaching many different languages. I do have just a couple examples in French that I will share, but hopefully not too much. And so I think a lot about scaffolding, how to pivot assignments, and incorporating authentic content. When I say incorporating authentic content, of course, there's a representational piece, but it's more than that. It's actually using the content to draw out aspects of languaging that are important, and to create affirmation, and to also take the spotlight off of students in our classes needing to be, you know, kind of like the speaker or the embodiment of certain kinds of identities. And so that's really important. So a couple of guiding principles. Gender is a journey. Gender does not need to be consistent to be valid. Pronouns may or may not align with our conditioned ideas about gender. And an individual's gender identity, or lack thereof, may or may not align with our conditioned ideas about what gender does or does not look or sound or act like. I think this is important in so many ways, not just destabilizing, right, the assumptions people make about gender versus gender identity, but also pronouns, and then pronouns across languages. That pronouns, you know, you look in the dictionary and it tells you this pronoun would be this in the other language, when that's not necessarily how people experience their linguistic sphere, right? Especially as we have these increasingly multilingual communities, and increasingly communities doing this kind of trans and gender queer languaging through technological spaces online, right? And written formats, and connecting in a global way. It gets much more complex. So for me, this is something I really believe is that we can't know our students' pronouns or gender identities unless they care to share these parts of themselves with us. If we're on campuses that allow pronouns on the roster and students can edit it, that's wonderful. We need these things. We need all of the tools. But just because the roster says a pronoun doesn't mean that A, the students updated it, B, they felt comfortable when they put it in there, C, somebody else wasn't watching, whatever, we just don't know. Nor, in my view, do we necessarily need to know. And so I wonder how we might invite our students into conversation with us with a spaciousness and openness and a very sincere care, without expectations, however, and without a need to know. When I think about how often everyone is sorted out in the world, all the time, right? The major stuff, the bathrooms, the forms, right? The sections at the store, everything, okay? That's always happening. What is it to have a classroom space where that doesn't happen? It doesn't mean that people can't self-articulate and differentiate, right? But it's not obligatory. And so we're going to talk quite a bit about that. Yeah, how do we do this? I don't know, but here's a few things that I do. One of the first things that I do, I think this is a good pedagogy for everything. This is another one of those questions where, what can support the students who are experiencing the most marginalization is something that supports everyone, right? So you fix the system for a couple of people, you fix the system for everyone. But humanizing ourselves makes a big difference. And many people have spoken to this already today. Even people who are cis and heterosexual have genders, right? And experience the impact of gender roles or other people's expectations about what their gender means for how they should be moving in the world, or what their family should look like, or how much body hair they should have, or whatever. So I think that's a nice way to create some solidarity and recognition that these are forces that shape everyone. I always say, queer theory is for everyone. I teach a queer theories class, but it's a good way to coalition build and to also, I think, cultivate a little bit of vulnerability. This is a nice strategy to work with our colleagues who are maybe trying to onboard in this work, right? And I have a few sources near the end of the slides that are nice, approachable ones that I love when people want to leave around the copy room. So I like to create a syllabus statement. It can be performative, certainly, if you're also not doing a bunch of other things, but having a syllabus statement, that's a formal document and it matters. And that is like an artifact of the class. So I think it is a thing we should do. What I do around trying to get to know my students is the hello survey. I do an electronic one, but I make it very clear with my students that I would like to know about them, but that I don't expect it. And that if they share with me, I think it's a gift. I think it's a gift if they share with me, and that they do not have to, and that I will share with them, but that does not mean that I expect it back, and also that I do invite it. And this includes pronouns. And, I know a lot of people do a pronoun circle up and the pronouns are optional to share. I think that that is very appropriate. And certainly when you have rapport, that's different. But when you have spaces with new people and maybe it's a little fraught and you don't know what else is going on outside of that classroom space, for me, I have moved into we just don't do that out loud. Sometimes people will still want to do it because they like to announce, and that's different than me establishing it. So I do that on the side via a form. And then I I often solicit anonymous feedback a couple times a semester as well, in hopes that if there are things I'm not aware of, I can work on that. But this kind of establishes a nice space for being gendered languaging bodies together. And I carve out time for it as well. Sometimes reflections in class, just giving a little bit of the class time back for students to do this. They tend to be very hyperextended, at least on our campus. They're very involved. They do a lot of different kinds of things. And so if I want to prioritize their self-reflection, I have to give them that time in class when they're there sometimes. And then once in a while, I like to go on retreat. And I mean this very broadly, but I think it's a kind of intervention as we're continuously stressed and things are busy and there's a lot of exposure to all kinds of media and, bombarding notifications from all of our devices, and our students are doing so much. I think just sometimes coming into the classroom and realizing it's been that week. Let's walk over to the geology museum and see some rocks. And we'll practice describing those rocks using gendered forms because they're rocks and they're not people. So that would kind of be a way to do something simple that kind of breaks with the routine, but can be quite meaningful to them as well. Just a couple more guiding principles. So for me, in our language classrooms especially, we can and must interrupt the impulse to make assumptions about gender and pronouns. And we ought to establish our classrooms and campuses as sanctuary spaces. I believe that as language educators, moreover, we are poised to become community resources on gender affirming language and practices. I've been very lucky to have colleagues in my department who have journeyed with me as I've changed my own pronouns and struggled with it, or had a breakdown moment before I don't know what my pronouns are, and that's also nonlinear. That will happen to me again, right? Like I am where I am right now, but it can be messy and that can be beautiful. But because we're language people, I think we have skills to support others in this work in all languages. Which is to say, are we the grammar authorities? Because I like to say that we are. So we see this grammar authority as like the academies, right? Who say whether this language is allowed or not. Or this little clip here in the middle is about a new law that's going through legislature in Iowa, the state right next to where my college is, and hopefully it will not pass, but it will ban all gender neutral language in world language classes at K-12. We already have bans on pronouns if the family doesn't know that that's the student's pronouns. So this is complex. Everybody is facing this in different ways, and we have different constraints depending on where we are and the kind of campus we're on. Okay, so there are grammar authorities though, and that's real. But we also are grammar authorities, and so we can't break the law, but there are ways to be strategic, and that's part of what I want to talk a little bit about and think through. So I think we really need to leverage the fact that we too are grammar authorities, like when we're in our classroom, but we don't want to, not make it clear to our students that there are the realities of the world, right? As evidenced in the bulk of the materials at our disposal and most of the textbooks that we have for the languages we teach. So the two challenges again. Okay, so we must create a space where our students are not obliged to disclose their gender identities in order to participate in activities or complete assignments. But we still need to teach them different concepts, but I really believe we can't oblige them. This is increasingly, if not everyone gets to have their gender be identified, then maybe no one does, right? Because what is that? Where's the equity in this? So it's something I'm thinking through a lot, okay? Students come to our spaces also already with a lot of knowledge. So I recognize that depending on at what point we get to meet them, we don't always control everything that they've been exposed to. And once they start learning about other things, it's going to get nebulous. But we can still center certain kinds of practices in our classroom, right? And we can prioritize things. So while we're doing that, we have to also affirm our students' genders and pronouns when they do share them with us, which is amazing, if we're allowed to, right? I'm allowed to do everything. I don't have constraints on my campus, and that is a gift. But I'm aware that some people do. So this other challenge related, we must create a structure in which our students develop tools to authentically express themselves and learn to navigate linguistic and cultural spaces that are less welcoming than our classrooms, okay? But yeah, we teach standard language too, right? It's not like we're not also teaching academic standard conventional language. So I love to think about this as registers. And in French, we have verlan, a type of slang. We have many regional versions of French, okay? This is all really important. We don't want to present a monolithic version of a language if we're interested in multiliteracies. Well, gender just languaging is part of that. only it can also be life-saving. And I believe other kinds of languaging are life-saving for people as well, right? But can you express yourself in a language is a big deal. I don't know if this is the right moment to say this, but another point is, I really believe, especially with tensions around the survival of language programs, it would behoove everyone to allow all students to express themselves in their language classrooms, and that it's a recruitment strategy. So that's just this other like administrative talking point in the back of my head. But I put a little bubble on this one because people will sometimes talk about, you know, the liberal arts bubble or the university bubble. And this is where I think about that sanctuary space, that like, yeah, there is a bubble, but also it's permeable. And we from the bubble can go out and make change, and we do. That is part of how sustainability and cultural shifts happen, through that co-education of each other and everyone in that space. And it trickles out, because the ways people learn language in our classrooms, then maybe they go out and they language in the world in that way, right? And that is powerful. And also it is a vulnerable space. And so we have to look through that bubble and see the outside and know there are real threats, right? When I get mispronounced, most places I go, unless I make an effort to present in a certain way, I decide whether I want to engage in a conversation about that or not, right? Not everyone deserves that. I'm just going to move through the world, right? And at the same time, there can be real threats, bodily threats. So when we're sending our students to study away, right? Things like that, we have to be prepared. They have to be prepared. They have to know. It's the same as when they're trying to get a job when they graduate and they're thinking about how are they going to be in that job search. If these are real realities in the climate that we're in. And so I think just having those conversations and not hiding from that piece of it is critical. So there are lots of ways to engage with gender inclusive language, as you all know way more about than I do. Today was so rich. To the best of my knowledge, no one has a standardization for any of the languages, but there are many proposed systems and beautiful systems and approaches and ever-evolving strategies and practices that we can draw on and integrate and activate in our classrooms and in our day-to-day lives. Very often I hear from teachers. I've had the opportunity to do quite a bit of work with like K-12 teachers and, you know, college and university teachers as well. People will want to just know, like, how's the way to do it? I want to do it this way. I want to know. And I understand because the job is real and I don't deal with the constraints of, you know, the K-12 system or trying to prepare students for an AP exam, right? I get them at a different point in their trajectory. So I have deep respect and want to continue to bridge that conversation with the teachers doing the work on the other side of that bridge. But I also don't like the idea of standardization, and I'll cite my colleague Chris Knisley at University of Arizona here from an article that I have a link to for you later, where Chris talks about the fact that kind of desire to just distill everything into a third alternative is simply a cislingualist compulsion. And then we're going to repeat the same kind of structural problems that we already have. We'll just have 3 options instead of 2, if you had a binary language. One other point is that this is our pedagogy regardless of who our students are. We don't wait for students to come out as trans or non-binary to then make accommodations by weaving gender expansive language and content into our courses. So we have to already be doing that. That's inclusive design. We don't have to do it all. We don't have to do all the things, but we have to do something. We have to have a placeholder to start out with so that that is there, it exists, it is on the map. It's our responsibility at the same time to triage, filter, and curate information. That is the facilitator role of the educator, right? We do this with everything. This is why people don't learn the subjunctive mood on the first day of class. You learn it later, right? So we have to just think about these things. Just because there's all this awesome languaging happening doesn't mean that it needs to all be introduced immediately. Like all things, we have to think through it. And it takes work because there aren't many models established for us. We're doing that work right now. This conference is doing that work. So we are the bosses because most of us are getting paid, okay? But the students are also agents in this languaging in the classroom. The community is doing it together. And so the ways in which we can allow them to have that agency, that self-efficacy, right? Like, I can't tell you what your pronouns are. You know, which pronouns feel good to you? Do any feel good to you, right? Maybe none. These kinds of conversations are important. So we can't police people's languaging. So back to the we are the grammar authorities. I do believe it's our responsibility to triage and filter and curate. And sometimes that means doing so under constraints, okay? But the stewardship of the body of language as a whole is a communal responsibility. So that's not one educator's responsibility to know. We do need each other and we need our students, right? We have to know, is language intelligible? Okay, if it's not, how do we help that language become intelligible to shift language? Not just, it's not intelligible, so it's not an option. That's not how it works. We build our vocabularies, right? But the constraints, okay? I put it in there. I don't know as much about it because I don't have those at my private liberal arts institution in the state of Illinois. I'm so thrilled. But there are real implications for people who are facing, you know, legal bars, institutional, you know, imperatives that deny these possibilities. And so my approach kind of takes all of that into consideration. If we're barred from providing gender expansive options that create space for all students, in my view, there's still things we can do. We can pivot to frameworks that don't hinge on first person and second person gendered expression, because first person and second person is the people in the classroom. We're talking to each other. So like, let's not do it in that way. And we can teach conventional grammars in relation to third person humans who are not our students. It exists, right? It's just we're not gonna make it about you. We're gonna do it, but it's not gonna be about you. You get to express yourself in all kinds of other ways, just, you know, through forms in the target language that are not problematic. These are my notes for a manifesto for us. We work with and against constraints. We establish vital placeholders that continuously evolve and unfurl. We activate a combinatorial approach that prioritizes clarity without sacrificing the flexibility and openness that are so critical in queer and trans communities. We cultivate a humanistic approach to language pedagogy. I'm citing the abstract from Wes's keynote this morning. And we make identity a sacred space. This is from a workshop I did recently. A participant said that when I was talking about sanctuary and stuff, and I was like, I love that. So make identity a sacred space, right? Everybody's always being sorted, maybe not in here. We remember that how we frame a question or a model sentence will shape the kinds of responses we're likely to receive. So this is the piece about us filtering all of this information. How are we going to present it? How are we going to set up the activity, right? What are we going to center? It's not that all that other stuff isn't there, but how do we center it? How do we organize it? And this takes time. So we take time to reflect and begin by building exercises that put the burden on us to negotiate the constraints and possibilities of language, rather than placing that burden on students in a way that spotlights, disadvantages, or disenfranchises some students over others. And this is a lot of work, and I don't do it well all the time. I'm like, hey, we're reading this short story that it would be anachronistic to use any gender inclusive language, so the story's just there. We can still talk about, you know, gender, but like, this is from 1870 or whatever. I'm like, you know, that's also going to be there, and we get tired. But when we can, right, when we can really care about this, it shifts the entire environment. So a quick pause to reflect. A few questions for you. If you want to write anything down on those documents in the folder, please do. The Jamboard or the Google Doc or the chat. But I want you to just be thinking about, these are the things I'm always thinking about. I'll notice when I'm resistant to something, right? When it's too hard, or this one was too complicated. How do I build to this next? Okay, just to note that. But in your teaching, which gender inclusive strategies are you most or least comfortable with, and why? You know, what's sometimes very tactile reasons. Other times it might just be a reason we don't quite have a sense of what's happening for us in that yet. What could you incorporate to make your teaching more inclusive of all genders, even in the presence of constraints, but ideally without them? Okay. So, when I say I don't have constraints, I don't have institutional constraints. I still have the constraints of the class and, you know, the curriculum and the benchmarks, right? So like that is also there. I'm glad I said that. So people don't think that I'm just like a free for all, do what I want. And third question, okay, and this is maybe a takeaway for going home. Consider a concept or topic that is particularly challenging when it comes to gender in your language or languages. How could you pivot your approach to engage this content in a more gender just way? And I'm going to give some examples of this, okay? So here I want to amplify and integrate a couple of points from Wes's keynote this morning. This is direct language from Wes. Language has life or death consequences, he said. Gender inclusive language means access to gender joy. Also, that was a direct quote from him. And this third one here is me paraphrasing about the 3 types of gender inclusive language, according to him, which is gender neutral, gender affirming, gender possible. So I really liked that. And I really wanted to like kind of lift it up, but also put it in conversation with other ways of thinking about that. Some of you might know the work of Artemis Lopez. I have really enjoyed the way that Artemis articulates that distinction between different types of non-binary language. I've always been troubled by the they that is both the affirming pronoun for some non-binary people, but also the they that just gets used for everybody all the time, and that tension that it's 2 theys, but that's my pronoun, and like so I like this distinction between the direct and the direct and the indirect non-binary language as one other way of talking about the usefulness of some structures that exist in our languages. Okay. And I'm speaking from my positioning as an Anglophone who teaches French, and I know some about Romance languages, but I know pretty much nothing else about the other languages. So we've moved through the challenges, though, in terms of these are the main tensions that I'm continuously like grappling with and want to hear from you about and continue the conversation around, like, how do we keep doing that better and better and in more authentic ways and in more interesting ways, and in ways that are, you know, more affirming of our students all the time and of each other. Okay, us too, we also exist. But approaches. Okay, so navigating, I'm going to move into kind of the third section here with some ideas, just some little takeaways, some things that I do in terms of scaffolding, pivoting, and incorporating authentic content. So I like to combine strategies. I also like to call that everyday poetics. Like I said, I came out of literary studies. So in French, for example, there's a pretty famous text now that's from the an author from the experimental writers group Oulipo, that's like writers and mathematicians who create texts under extreme constraints. Garita's Sphinx from 1986, which is an English translation, no gender markers for the protagonists at all, right, in French, but it's standard French. This was something that like inspired me and helped me in my pedagogy before 2015, when I started to see all these forms populating on the internet, right? So before that, I was like, okay, well, I'm gonna have to figure it out, so I'm just gonna circumvent everything. But there are risks with that. That's what I'm thinking about with the everyday poetics. Develop gender affirming strategic scaffolding, pivot assignments. When I say textbook, literally the stuff that's in most of the textbooks, but also just the classic stuff that are how do we communicate, and we're teaching languages for self-expression in everyday life. And so what does that look like, and how can we do that in a way that's going to be intelligible and affirming and not overly complex or not unnecessarily complex without sacrificing the importance of linguistic saliency. And then centering authentic gender diverse content, of course. So just a couple examples from French, so forgive me, but I tried to pick some that I thought would maybe be approachable. So when we think about epicene words, I've seen this movement more recently now that élève, the epicene word for student, which used to kind of just mean like younger students, is now replacing more often kind of students at different levels, because it's the same word for people of any gender, and that's really wonderful. We could also create a rewording and shift the focus onto the verb and just say that somebody studies, they're studying whatever. So that's something that works in French. The mid dots, which we see in many, many languages now, but that are of course contested. This is wonderful in writing. It's not pronounceable, but that's another word for student. And so this is a point of tension where visibility of people who use feminine pronouns in French comes at the expense of a space for people who use neither feminine nor masculine pronouns. And we all know this. If you know anything about a language similar to French, I've heard a lot of people talking about the masculine, general, the masculine neutral today. Studies show that even if a masculine neutral is shown, it doesn't evoke masculine representations for people. So the linguists say, yes, it's a neutral, but that's not how people experience it, right? And so this is an interesting tension too. And then neologisms and neomorphemes. And I put neologism in parentheses because as the beautiful trajectory of interesting languaging forms in English in Dennis Barron's book that's cited here shows these, and this is like, I need to remind myself because I just use the word neologism. It's like a lot of what we say are neopronouns in English have existed for like 200 years, just everybody shut it down and it got in like one newspaper article and nobody talked about it or connected around it. And it's not necessarily new. And so calling it new can minimize this long history. So examples in French, the yel, or an ending that would be a non-binary ending here, étudiants. Just again, right, we have neologisms that we can think through. They're not standard French, so for in French, that's a problem. Mid dots, also not standard French, but because they're used a lot, journalists, feminist spaces, allied spaces, educational spaces, and there's overlap there with non-binary languaging. We get to see a lot of cultural documents that include these, and that is helpful in the classroom. Epicene words, though, being approved by the French Academy. And here's a list from one of the organizations in Canada that just kind of shows you all kinds of, binary forms, and a great alternative. I would love to just have books full of epicene synonyms. I'm just going to move through these a little bit quickly here, but they're in the slides if you want to see more. How many organizations are doing this work? A couple out of Canada. Here's one out of Switzerland. This is all around French languaging. Okay, so I'm interested in all these new forms and the old forms that are just getting called new. And I'm also interested in forms for representation of people who use feminine pronouns. And so for me, we have to make space for all of those forms, and not one at the expense of the other. Here's just a neat article about the linguist Alpharatz at the Sorbonne, but it's a nice example of seeing multiple types of gender inclusive forms in the same context. So like venu and venue, how is it that you, came to identify with this non-binary gender? They're pronounced the same, but it's two different styles. So there are these little snippets of things on the web that we can find that can be nice for including in class. Somebody telling their own story, also an academic and an activist. As a French example, here's a book from 2020 that's like a few dollars on Amazon and a nice starting point. And increasingly, I think we can find these kinds of things in the contemporary media, stories that are also really intersectional in ways that are powerful. This one happens to be about immigrant and refugee communities, right? Like languaging is also migrating all the time, and so are people's bodies, and that's the conversation we're in. So when we see an X on a French word, but that makes it easy for a lot of my students who also speak Spanish and they get it, that's powerful, and we can have that solidarity across languages and learn from each other. And then sometimes it's a question of, well-known individuals who are going into a different linguistic space. Zanele Nuholi here doing a big photo exhibit. Obviously, I didn't get to see this, but I saw it online. I would have loved to have, right? But a non-binary photographer from South Africa who is non-binary, who talks it out with people. Here's an example how you negotiate. Okay, and these articles about me in French, this is the language that is going to work for me. It's a conversation, it's not an assumption. And then something we might get to talk about more, because I was curious if in some of other people's languages you're seeing this movement. This is a collective, I think they're located in Belgium, but the designers are coming from multiple French Francophone places. Binary, where you can use all their inclusive typefaces that blend characters and ligatures. It's just so beautiful. And I just got a copy of the book about it that came out. But a lot of these, you know, some are pronounceable, but some aren't pronounceable. They're just in the written text, which is also amazing. And here's an example of one in French that's available open access that blends these forms. So here you have a plural pronoun. We clearly see this is a plural. It's a plural pronoun, third person, but that's all we can say. And then other great sources here. I'm going to wrap up in just a couple of minutes. So one more awesome slide from Chris Knisley. If you need language about, you know, how do we justify this? How do we talk back to people who don't like it, right? It's all right there. And then how do we rework some of these activities? Okay, this little chart was not in one of my textbooks, that's from the internet. But I like to actually show something like that. So my students are aware, when you see these things online, when you're studying or looking up different things and you recognize it, yeah, the exercises in the computer system are going to want you to produce that language. They're going to mark it wrong if you produce some of the language that I also teach you. That doesn't mean that it's wrong. Okay, some people are going to correct you because you used an informal instead of a formal with them. That's also, you know, problematic. And so I like to put those things kind of mashed up, right? So we can see that it's a problem and a tension, and there are different ways of languaging and kind of flesh that out together. So sometimes I'll present an activity even in that way, and reframing things like that, you know. It's always, who are the important people in your life? And that includes animals. But looking for epicene forms here, right? So there's all the stuff in the textbook about the family. It's there, the vocab lists are there. But if this is the slide that I start with, all the weird stuff in the textbook is like in the background a little bit more, you know? So that's like one way to grapple with it. And then just a couple more tips. I love to use, I literally have this otter and this kiwi. They're a la and a la, so they're an class and an in class. And so they don't mind being mispronounced. They also don't mind just experiencing other kinds of linguistic errors in the classroom. And so it's a good way to practice the binary forms that our students might really need to learn in order to get a good grade on a standardized test or whatever, but without making it be about them. And so this is like my last little thing. I'm not a design person, so this isn't great. This is my whole approach here, okay? We have speech and we have writing, and I like to think in the middle with those epicene forms, okay? But also always adding in to the center the few forms that we absolutely need for full expression, right? The few pronouns that we need, but I don't want to include all of the options right away. So I want to think carefully about how I move out from the center of that circle, moving from wherever there's an option in the standard languaging, let's start with that and build out. We keep that placeholder and then we build out. And we move out to forms that are very easy to pronounce or pronounce the same way, even if they're marked differently in writing, right? Or they're finally on the edges, kind of unpronounceable or super differentiated. We use those, we just use them more sparingly, right? We don't have to put those in the very center, they're there, but this is a way to kind of hold space for all that is out there, and we want to be able to do this. So here's one example with French, just really quickly. with sampa, which is nice, in the middle. And you can see there's some other epicene words that also mean nice, they're in the middle. And we move out to a word amical, also means nice. There are connotations, but it means nice. There's more vocab than we can learn. So like, why not just, so amical, but they're all pronounced the same. Okay, so and if we're just having an activity in class, it doesn't matter if you weren't even teaching the mid dot, it's still pronounced amical. And then on the outside, we have some of the forms that are starting to get a little more differentiated and a little bit more challenging, including forms that aren't pronounceable. So that's kind of how I think through it, right? And then I try to include all the time things like these amazing photos. That's a resource for you. And this is a recap of my pedagogical touchstones, because I do believe we have to prioritize clarity, right? And broad communicative potential, but we also have to center in the ways that I've described. And I already said all these things, except that I wanted to give a shout out to Nushana Shtari's talk from earlier about the narrative work and that narrative and creative ways for working through and with gender. I thought that was really beautiful, and I wanted to like add that in on point 4. Yeah, but those are in the drive for you. And these last slides are just takeaways for if you didn't already know them. In the middle here is an awesome zine that's free to print. These are all in English, but they're translated to everywhere. The recent perspectives column from Modern Language Journal, for which Chris Knisley did the anchor piece. I wanted people to have a link to that if they hadn't seen it. It's really important that, this issue is being centered in so many different spaces now. And then some other great ones. And finally, the Gender and Language Project, and Ben, one of our conveners today. So just huge shout out to that work. Went a couple minutes over, but I would love to chat with you all and continue the conversation beyond our space today as well. So thanks.